Nirvana were peers. We were sort of the same scene. They were in an unusual circumstance in that they had gotten famous, but I still considered them peers. I considered them part of the same circle that we had all grown up in. So working with Nirvana was not intimidating in that respect. The pressure that they were under, was immediately apparent to me that they were in a different world in that regard.
When you recorded In Utero back in 1993, what exactly was the issue with Nirvana's label?
Long story short, the band recorded the album In Utero by hiring me directly, so I was never contractually bound to their record company in any way. That was a break in the paradigm of the way record companies wanted to do business. Record companies wanted to be the responsible party so that they could exert control over situations by withholding payment or demanding things, or, if your business depends on you exerting control over the people you work with, and one of those people has a successful record that doesn't obey that protocol, it's a dangerous precedent. I immediately started getting calls from journalists who were getting leaks from the record company. And one of those phone conversations was, I just got off the phone with Gary Gersh. He says he can't release the new Nirvana album and it's your fault. Would you like to comment? There was an effort to shut down that record and make the band do it again. I had a conversation with the band where I said, well, I'll listen to everything, and if I feel like I can do better, then I'm happy to try to do another round of mixes or whatever. And I had a copy of the master, and so I listened to it all, and I honestly felt like we had wrung the sponge, like we had done the absolute best that we could to that music. And so I said, yeah, if you guys want to remix stuff on your own, you have my blessing, but I feel like I can't add anything to the process. And it seemed like if that instinct was indulged, that kind of second-guessing instinct was indulged, then it would be like a collapse. It would be a string of dominoes, in that, okay, we're going to remix this song because it's a single. Okay, we're going to remix this song because it's a second single. Okay, we're going to remix the whole album. Okay, we've remixed the whole album and they're still not happy. We're going to re-record the whole album. Okay, thanks for your efforts, but, now we have to play by the book. So I felt like if I participated in that process, that it would cascade into a capitulation. And so I said, look, if you guys want to remix stuff on your own, you have my blessing. It's not my record, it's your record. And in the end, they did. They re-recorded some of the vocals backing vocals on one song, and they remixed a couple of songs. And the album that was released, ultimately, was the recordings that we did, that is, the band and I did. The bulk of the record were the original mixes that they did that were originally rejected. There were 2 or 3 songs, I forget, that were remixed and subsequently released as singles and included on the album. But the main thrust of that description is that the record that ended up in the stores is the record the band wanted people to hear. There was a slight difference between that record and the record that they ended up with at the end of the sessions, but that was their decision, and they decided that they wanted to release that album in that way. It's their record. They get to do that. Whatever like minor bruise to my ego there is that they wanted to remix some stuff is completely irrelevant to the fact that that band remained in control of that record, and they released a record that they were proud of, right? That's the end of the story as far as I'm concerned. I was working for them. I was an employee, right? So, like, the guy that installs the toilet in your house doesn't get to tell you how to paint it, right? So that's my relationship with that band. And so I have no beef with the band. They were under extraordinary pressure. Like, everyone around them was telling them that they had to play ball. Every single person in their orbit, all of their management people immediately wanted to capitulate because they were afraid for their careers. All of the people that worked with them and in proximity to them at the record label, they were all afraid of their careers. Everyone at the record label was afraid that they were going to have a bad quarter if the Nirvana record wasn't a smash hit. So up the entire corporate ladder, everyone was terrified of this band making their own decisions. The first day everyone was congregated at the studio, they didn't all live in the same place, so getting them together for a meeting or whatever obviously took some wrangling. They all convened at the studio, and the very first day at the studio, someone came in with a manila envelope full of legal documents that they all had to sign. Just a stack of them, And they were everything from some functional thing, like this is so that you can collect royalties on radio play in territories controlled by Australia. All right, okay, well, fine, whatever. All right, this is so they can use a photograph of you on a magazine cover to promote this thing. Okay, whatever. This is a lawsuit where somebody had a band called Nirvana and he wants to get paid off because your band is called Nirvana. Okay, here, fine, fuck it, whatever. This is some kid who broke her leg at a show and wants you to pay something extra because you were playing it. Okay, fine, fuck it, whatever. Just a stream of these things came in the very first day. I've never had to deal with anything like that in my life, But that was just, another day in the band of Nirvana for them. They just had to deal with shit like that constantly. So it was obvious to me that they were under, pressures of a different magnitude than anybody that I dealt with. And so I tried to make a point of not pressing them for any indulgences. Like, I didn't pretend to be an intimate friend with any of them. They had all these people that were trying to leech onto them and trying to weasel their way into their inner circle. I didn't want to be one of those people. They had people asking them for things constantly, mementos or indulgences or tickets or autographs or pictures. Like, I didn't want to be one of those people. So I gave them not just space, but autonomy and a distance between them and me that respected how much they already had to put up with, and that I wasn't going to be an additional burden to them. I'm in an unusual position. I work in a studio, so bands that want to make recordings of their music come here to express themselves. So I get to see a steady stream of people doing unique and personal music to satisfy themselves for no other reason than that they are driven to do it, right? I cannot take seriously the idea that music is now not good, or that music is now not serious or not substantial, or that there are not people trying to express themselves, because I see them every day. That is my entire client base. I would have closed up shop a long time ago if those people didn't exist, right? I think it's I think it is a mistake to equate the superficial tier, the superficial level, the top tier of mainstream pop music, which is always going to be aggressively promoted and is always going to be saturating all of the media markets and is going to be in the top of everybody's news feed and on every playlist on Spotify. Like, that stuff is always going to be bullshit. It's always been bullshit. That sort of mainstream mass consumption music is always going to be awful. There was a brief period, there have been several brief periods where different idiomatic elements of the underground or the legitimate music scene have been brought to the surface and have been sort of skimmed by that industry, the mainstream industry, right? There have been brief moments of that. But by and large, pop music is awful. It has always been awful.
I feel like people are branding themselves in a way that can get them famous, as opposed to actually expressing their values. And to me, that's my biggest beef with music today. Yeah.
There is always a professional tier of musicians, like people who are insubstantial as people and as artists, and who don't have any closely held beliefs and don't have a core set of ideas that they're committing to as artists. There are always going to be people like that the professional mainstream music business can fashion into figureheads and exploit. Those people will always be there. They have always been there. There will always be that tier of music, of insubstantial, nonsensical, content-free pop music, right? There is also always a tier of dedicated, committed artists who are doing things to satisfy their creative impulse and for whom the music means the world, right? There are always going to be people for whom music is their primary mode of expression. And those people are always going to be making music that is substantial. Whether you like it or not, it means something to them, right? I think that dismissing an era of music as being a superficial era or being an insubstantial era mistakes this mainstream tier of fluff for the whole of music, when in reality the whole of music is extremely deep, and as you get deeper into your particular tastes, you find more and more value in it, more and more of interest. There is a kind of an appeal to authenticity for people who cling to rock music, right? Like that dude is actually drumming, that dude is actually playing the guitar, and you can't fake virtuosity. Like, you're either good at it or you're not good at it, right? Bearing in mind that my background is from the punk underground, things like competence and virtuosity were not prized. Like, it wasn't that you necessarily needed to be ashamed of being good at your instrument, but the mode of expression, that is like being a shredder or being, like a Wicked Chops drummer, that was much, much less important than what you were trying to express and what you were trying to do. A lot of my favorite bands were formed by neophytes with no experience playing music, and they used their creative minds to fashion a vocabulary that they could use themselves to express themselves. And it didn't necessarily map or correspond with what you would be taught by a guitar instructor or what the traditions of music would have valued up to that point. For the better part of 70 years or whatever, there was a music business that was essentially the record business, right? When somebody said they were involved in the music business, what they meant was that they were in the record business. Or occasionally they were involved in something ancillary to that, like radio promotions, which was all about trying to sell records, right? So the record business model meant that there was a kind of a singular thrust to the industry of selling music of a certain scale, right? And so you had phenomenon bands. You had bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Jackson 5 and Stevie Wonder and Pink Floyd, and you had these massive artists who put out many albums, and all of them were heard by everybody, essentially, right? That's gone. There is no singular focus on selling records now. So there isn't a singular industry that is promoting things in the same way. At the moment, bands can operate very autonomously, right? If you wanted to go home tonight and coin a band name and record some stuff and post it up on YouTube, you could be an internet sensation tomorrow. Like, you could be a popular artist tomorrow if you wanted to. And if people like your stuff now, there's no barriers to access for you. So it is possible for bands to operate completely autonomously now. During the physical media era, you had to have facilitators. You had to have people who would manufacture and press records and ship them to record stores. You had to have record stores that would stock your records and run promotions, and you tie them in with video releases and things like that. There was an awful lot that needed to happen for a band to achieve mainstream success and penetration. In the last few years, we've seen just a string of people who have, put themselves out there, released their own music independently, and become successful. Chance the Rapper is a millionaire, and he made his music at home and put it out on the internet for nothing. That sort of thing I think is emblematic of the era that we have entered. We are not in a position now where old dudes in suits can tell the creative class how to behave. You can do whatever the fuck you want and record it however you want and present it however you want, because there is access to an audience through the internet. And, you have to figure out on your own how to make money out of that if that's important to you. But if the main thing that you want to do is make music and get music out there, you can do it now. There's nothing preventing it. I cannot see that as anything but a truly great development. That the music business has changed away from the physical model, and now every band and every person that makes music has to sort of figure out their own way to have a relationship with their audience. I think that's a perfectly fine development. And I think that progress in that direction is unstoppable. You already have things like self-identified communities being created where bands will promote a tour to their audience on their Facebook page or through other social media or whatever, without having to use a promotions company. And then their audience can buy tickets directly from them or through an agency that they work with, without having to involve the venues at all, without having to involve the box offices at the venues, without having to, and whatever inefficiencies and corruptions are nascent there. Like, you don't have to deal with those people. I think that degree of autonomy requires effort on the part of the bands and the music. But if you want to be autonomous and you want to create your own future, the tools are available for it now. And I cannot see that as a bad thing. The glorious thing about the internet now is that no matter how minuscule or how specific your tastes are, you can indulge them for eternity at great depth, right? If you're only interested in Japanese thrash metal done by cute girls, there is now an extraordinary volume of that. You could listen to nothing else for days. If you were only interested in video game theme song cover versions, if that was what you were really stoked about, you could fill an iPod or 2 or 20 with just those, like bands performing video game cover versions, right? There is no thing about music now that doesn't have the capacity to find its natural audience. Whatever kind of music you want to make, I guarantee you, if you put it up on YouTube, you will get somebody to listen to it, right? It may not be a lot of people, but what that means now is that every itch gets scratched, and every person can have a music listening experience that's tailored specifically to them. There are players like Spotify and YouTube and Bandcamp that have an extraordinary reach and influence in the same way that MTV and Much Music and the corporate radio station networks used to have. But one layer beneath that is a completely wide open experience. And for someone who's interested in music, that wide open experience is very easy to access now. That not a lot of money changes hands. And that is the thing that the remnants of the old music industry, the sort of dinosaurs that rail against how terrible the internet is, those people are bemoaning the fact that people can now indulge their music interests for free, right? And I see that as exceedingly bad faith on their part. Of course people are going to listen to music for free. Why would people pay for things that they can get free? There is no argument for it. The residual music industry wants to sort of guilt trip the entire universe into giving them money just because they were used to being paid for something. And it's absurd, you know.
So what are your thoughts on piracy then?
I've said publicly that I reject the term piracy. People listening to music is people listening to music. It's not piracy. They're not stealing anything. They're not taking anything. They're not damaging an asset. They're listening to music. If anything, they're broadening the audience for it. And the people who make the music, if they're savvy, will find out ways to exploit that newly broadened audience. There's a punk band from Chicago called Pegboy. Not one of the biggest names in music. Not even one of the biggest names in Chicago, right? They're from Bridgeport. They're not even one of the biggest names in Bridgeport, right? This year, they were able to go to South America and play shows in Brazil solely based on the fact that over time they had found a cult following in Brazil. Their music had percolated through the ether thanks to the internet, and they had found an audience. And so this band, they haven't been a particularly active band. They haven't done a whole lot. But they can say, yeah, our band brought us to Brazil, right? That kind of thing is incredible. That's the sort of thing that simply couldn't happen if all of those people in Brazil had to physically buy an item and that money had to snake its way up through the chain of command before the band could be remunerated. There's just no way that would have happened. And the reason that you know that there's no way it would have happened is that it didn't happen until now. You know, there are thousands of stories like that. Like bands discovering that they have a following in a distant place and then going there and being welcomed like heroes. That's an incredible thing to have happened, right? Bands whose careers in an active sense were relatively short are seeing their recordings survive and get disseminated and their audience grow and their following grow such that a band that has been defunct for 20 or 30 years can often now mount a successful reunion tour because their music has been able to percolate out into an audience that would support it. Whereas previously, when it was kept at bay by the gatekeepers of the radio stations and the record stores and the professional music industry, their music could never break through that. Their music could never get into the hands of people who would like it, and now it can. You know.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I have heard people say that rock is dead. I don't buy that. I mean, they haven't killed ska, for fuck's sake. How are they going to kill rock, you know? I don't think there's any one mainstream at the moment. You know, there's always going to be a superficial pop music idiom. There's always going to be this sort of bullshit, you know, and I don't expect that to change. There's always been that tier. I don't expect that's... I have no reason to think that that's going to change. There's always going to be bullshit like that. There will always be interesting rock bands. They may not be elevated to that pop star status ever again. But that doesn't particularly bother me because that's not the only way to find music. In my mind, the two paradigms of being a performing musician and being a recording engineer are completely different. There's a lot of crossover in personnel in that, I was in a band for years. I am in a band now. I consider myself something of a musician, but also my straight job is that I'm a recording engineer. And that's true for a lot of my peers as well. And I think the exposure that I have had to the culture of musicians makes me a more sensitive engineer, makes me a more sympathetic engineer. Engineering is a very technical and taxing profession. You have to split your attention amongst a lot of different things, and all of them have very specific requirements. And so you're monitoring things constantly, and you're interrogating different signals to find out how they're doing and solving problems dozens at a time, things like that. It's not a particularly creative enterprise. I think there is very little about that has helped me or translated into the creative side of my life, being a musician, being in a band. The only tangential things that I can think of are, like, if I imagine a particular sound for a piece of music, for a song or a piece of music, there may be a technical aspect to that, an execution aspect to that, as far as recording is concerned, that I will already have in mind when I dream up this special sound. Like, I'd like to have this very distant sound in this moment. Like, I know what that means. That means I'm going to have to make a regenerative echo. It's probably going to have to be relatively long. It's probably going to have to, roll off the high frequencies so it doesn't clatter. Like, technical stuff can enter into those sort of creative decisions. But they're completely different worlds. Like, when I'm sitting in the chair as an engineer working on someone else's music, the last thing I'm thinking about is the tempo or the key or, the aesthetic decisions of the music. I'm concerned about the nuts and bolts of not doing damage while it's being recorded. I came up through the underground music scene, through the punk rock scene, and I and my peers in that scene never considered any kind of a professional relationship with music. Like, we were doing music because it was the most exciting thing that we were involved in, and that's how we wanted to spend our time. No one, literally no one, thought that it was a career or that it was a way to make a living, right? So the pressures that we put on ourselves were all self-imposed. Like, you wanted to be awesome. You wanted to make records that were great. You wanted to put on shows that freaked people out, and then, like, the notion of being a professional musician never crossed anybody's mind. You had bands like Sonic Youth and Husker Du and the Replacements, who had cut their teeth in the sort of grubby punk rock and underground music scene, but had sort of graduated into a mainstream presence and had been signed to big record labels and were now part of the mainstream music business. And then there was a second generation of those bands that were sort of inspired by that to, like, have professional aspirations, as it were.
Is it a different approach when you're working with someone like, let's say, a Kurt Cobain or a Robert Plant compared to, like, the indie artists you work with? Do you approach things differently?
I believe that I give everybody the same degree of credit, and I take everybody's music seriously. So if I'm working with somebody who has notoriety, then there might be more pressure on them. They might have some expectations in terms of my deference, and I don't want to insult somebody by not being deferential, for example. So when I was working with Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, obviously I'm working with people of extraordinary stature with a lot of experience, and they've made a lot of great records. I've made some records, so I feel like I have to treat them with a degree of deference that pays respect to their experience and their expectations, right? So I'm probably more, and it's also intimidating to work with somebody who's, like, super fucking famous. I did a record with Iggy Pop, and it was really hard for me to get past the point in the morning when the doorbell rang and, the intercom says, "Hey, it's Iggy." Like that, you just you freeze in moments like that. What do I do? Iggy Pop's at my front door,
Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it.
No problem.
People still believe in the power of rock and roll music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkissian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.